Let's lay down the bare bones of a new season. It's time for Architecture, Coffee, and Ink. Hello, this is Hollywood C, and you're listening to Architecture, Coffee, and Ink, a podcast dedicated to introducing concepts, detailing out designs, and tackling the architecture you might not realize the meaning behind. I'm your hostess, and I am here today to start introducing you to the designs that make you wonder why. So I ask you to brew your coffee, grab your sketchbook and pen, and let's begin. Hello, my designers, dreamers, and everyone in between, and welcome to 2023. This is a part of my big relaunch as I rejoin the podcasting world. I don't know about everyone else, but the transition to the new year has been rather rough. And to add insult to injury, I was visiting part of the country where we were praying for the temperature to warm back up to 0 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 17.78 Celsius. But I've decided let's rewrite the narrative this year and kick off into the season with some spooky architecture. This episode, Tunnels Part 2, is a part of my Eerie Arc. For those new to the show, the Eerie Arc was part of my Halloween series that I never finished when I had to take an unexpected hiatus with the show starting last October. During my hiatus, I was asked by several of you to continue it as a side segment, so here it is. I took some time during the hiatus to set up the show's schedule through April, so right now, in addition to our normal Tuesdays each week, we will have a Religions of the World episode on the second Thursday, and an Eerie Arc episode on the last Thursday. If you're a new listener, welcome to the show. This is a two-part episode, and the Tunnels Part 1 was previously released before all this, all the way back in October. If you haven't listened to that yet, you really should go ahead and pause this episode and check it out. Don't worry, I'll wait. Just remember to always check your sources, check your facts, and most importantly, check me. But let's go ahead and give a 30-second recap of the previous episode, just in case. During episode 1, we focused on some general information on Shanghai, which is a form of human trafficking where people were forced into the service of ships, oftentimes kidnapped from bars and brothels. This extremely problematic term originates as the kidnapped sailors were often forced onto Western ships that were bound to locations in Asia for their final destination on trans-Pacific trips. In some cases, the slaves were forced into military service, in others for transporting goods, sometimes piracy. The reasons that this horrible practice occurred varied, and the final destination was entirely based on who they were sold to. This was a global pandemic that finally ended with several seamen acts across multiple countries. We also talked about the Salem Tunnel in Salem, Massachusetts, which is a series of several tunnels reported to be underneath the town, allowing the smuggling of goods and peoples in and out while being literally underneath the noses of the innocent civilian. And the worst part of it was that it was paid for by masquerading as a public service project. For today, we are focusing on the Portland Underground, or the Shanghai Tunnels as they're more popularly known as, in Portland, Oregon. As I mentioned during part 1, several of the original articles from the 1800s that you can find online that first mention the tunnels use extremely racist and bigoted language. I deliberately didn't include any links that connect to those sources. But if you decide to research more on your own, please be aware of what you can potentially run into, especially my younger listeners. So with that in mind, let's dive into this tale of betrayal and murder. I mentioned in the previous episode that the transition in the workforce from seeing the ocean as a good way to make your fortune to the gold rush caused a huge deficit in the workforce. Instead of captains having their pick of strapping young lads fleeing to the sea and sending wages home, countless scores of people were hoping to strike it rich in a fertile land that was quote unquote unexplored. I think I've been pretty vocal in the past about how I feel about that, as this idea really discounts the rich and vibrant cultures and tribes that have already been living here, so I won't repeat it again. But what I would like to refresh everyone's memory on is the fact that going into this, there's a deficit across several countries' workforce that's not limited to the private sector, but crossing into government, naval in particular. I remember the very first time I had ever heard of the tunnel. A long time ago, in a time far away, I had an extremely vivid imagination as a much younger Hollywood, if you can believe it. So needless to say, I wasn't supposed to be watching shows like Criminal Minds, given my likelihood to convince myself of people lurking behind the shower curtain. But I knew that if I snuck downstairs at certain times, I could watch episodes. It didn't work ever, but for some reason, I managed to sneak an episode in. After one of these episodes, I was flicking through the channels and a documentary caught my eye, as it was back when they had to announce what was coming up next. And the advert was promising murder, pirates, and hidden treasure, so I was sold. And when I watched, my breath was taken away by the idea of winding catacombs, toppled with gold coins, and chests stacked high. Imagine my surprise later on to find that my Indiana Jones-like fantasies were not only completely wrong, but were based on a fable that might not have even existed in the first place. We are actually going to kick off this in-depth exploration by going straight into the history, then jumping into the architecture. The underground and the tunnels recently captivated popular culture. Despite this, many of the stories and myths I researched online could be traced back over the years, spanning even as far back as to the time the city of Portland was incorporated. But it was recently driven into the spotlight through the efforts of several key figures and organizations. The city of Portland has an extremely unique history, and the architecture and organization of the city is completely fascinating. While I was researching Portland for a school project, I was introduced to one of my favorite quotes about modern cities. I actually found it on the Oregon Historical Society's website, though I have never read the book it came from, as used copies currently retail for $500. The quote starts, "Although of a different order, the history of the modern city should be no less interesting than that of an ancient metropolis like Jerusalem or Athens. It treats no less of human endeavor, and no less segregates and epitomizes human life. If that in which men busy themselves, and that which they produce is anywhere or at any time calculated to attract attention and demand investigation and analysis, why not here in Oregon? On the banks of the Willamette, as well as 5,000 to 10,000 miles away in Spain or in Turkey." Harvey Scott, History of Portland, 1890. For me, history needs to be learned from, and that means diving into the hard topics. And using this quote to analyze the city of Portland shows how this captivating and enchanting city of today came to be. The name of the city was determined through a coin toss. Originally, William Overton and Ashla Lovegood had purchased shares of an area of land being called the Clearing in 1843. Overton later sold his shares to Francis Pettygrove, and it was Pettygrove and Lovejoy who did the coin toss, as they each wanted to name the future city after their own hometowns. After the historic toss in 1845, Portland spread out and is now situated today around the Willamette River and the Columbia Rivers on the Portland Basin, with Vancouver, Washington just across the Columbia. The Columbia is how the ships connected to the Pacific Ocean. The tunnels were believed to have been started in Old Town, Chinatown, and were built to be linked to the downtown and the dock. Due to extreme racial-based restrictions in effect, the city limited who and where people could live within the city based on which minority they belonged to. For the newly arriving immigrants from Asia, this eventually led to the formation of Old Town, which eventually became one of the largest in the country during the time period. Additional laws, restrictions, and discrimination put into place limitations on what jobs and businesses could be owned, and eventually gangs started to move into the area. At first, the gangs were paid by the city to police the area, until eventually the police started to show up with hammers and conduct raids. However, by that time, this area had already become associated with being an epicenter of trade. Tunnels were built underground to allow the movement of goods from the ships to the cellars of the businesses the goods were going to be sold from. And this idea seemed to spread like wildfire from there to the entire city. As like in the previous episode, the focus was on how to avoid damaging the wares before they could be sold, and in undoubtedly the case of a few businesses across the whole city, bringing in hot merchandise before it could be caught. With this in mind, let's take a moment and consider the two arguments for and against the existence of the tunnels. Starting first with those against. With these facts, I noticed that some articles refer to the underground like it's a physical location, clearly referring to the tunnels themselves, while other articles use the word underground interchangeably when discussing anything to do with illegal activities, such as the prostitution rings and slave trades. Several people believe that while Shanghai has undoubtedly occurred in Portland, the tunnels themselves would have never been used for smuggling people. Instead, the belief is that it was primarily used for gang activity. Additionally, it would have housed brothels, drug dens, particularly with a focus on opium, and for gangs to set up gambling dens outside of the use of moving goods. Another idea brought up frequently is that fact that during the Prohibition, the tunnels would have been a great place to hide alcohol, set up speakeasies, or hidden underground bars. Another argument against the tunnels is rooted in its history. The worst of the human trafficking in Portland would have occurred from the years 1850 to 1941. While I mentioned in the recap that this was a global issue, the worst of it generally occurred in larger cities like Portland and San Francisco. Unfortunately, larger cities means more people and less opportunity to be caught. All in all, it was estimated that at the height of the operation, somewhere between 1,500 to 3,000 people would have been trafficked through the city of Portland per year. You will see a lot of variation between the sources on the exact number, and I think in part that is because some focus exclusively on those kidnapped to ships, while others include the countless women who are believed to have been sold into prostitution as well. So how does that tie into the tunnels? The belief is that, like the previous episode, the tunnels were used in combination with hidden rooms, trapdoors called deadfalls, to trap people and transport them to be sold. The main issue lies in the idea that the tunnels were used to physically move people from location to be sold. Some historians state that while there's enough evidence to prove that people were held down there in some cases, there was never enough evidence to prove that they were transported through the tunnels. That's right, the primary debate isn't whether or not there was a few tunnels, but how they were used. Some advocates for the tunnel theory have claimed that the previous city's officials, and we're talking back in the height of this back in the 1850s to 1940s, deliberately covered up the history to prevent the secret from besmirching the name. However, it's the cities that also cast doubt on whether or not the tunnels would have existed to the extent needed to smuggle people in the first place. As many of you know, river levels will fluctuate from year to year. Not a problem once or twice, but as any homeowner can tell you, constant flooding causes structural problems and pretty hefty bills. The level of change for the period of time we're talking about means that several of the tunnels would have likely collapsed or been flooded and completely unusable for large chunks of time. For many, this makes it seem unlikely no one would have noticed a sprawling series of catacombs underneath the fabric of the city, especially if it was half filled with rushing water. For others, this makes them think it's more likely it took so long to become well known, because in a way, the river was carrying off the secrets of the dead before anyone else could find them. But I mentioned that the tunnels had enough evidence to suggest that people have been at the very least imprisoned down there. In several locations, they found broken glass scattered in front of jail cells, piles of shoes, and clearly defined rooms and cages. And with that, let's move into discussing the biggest supporters of the tunnel theory, why and how they think it happened, and just how they brought this whole topic into the light. Starting with Michael P. Jones. Jones was born in 1951 and passed away in March 2020. While he played in the tunnels as a child, he later on in the 70s spent time working at the Transient Bank, which in some articles they will call a, quote, hobo bank, where he came into contact with people who either remembered or knew those who disappeared and were believed to have been kidnapped at the tail end of the Shanghai epidemic. Remember, this would have been ending barely 30 years earlier from when he met these people. Jones believed that the truth behind the tunnels was a mixture of everything we've discussed. He created the Cascade Geographical Society in 1979, which, while it included tours of the tunnel, also provided educational opportunities focused on the Cascade Mountains. He also was a part of the founding of Project Discovery, the Mount Hood Sacred Lands Preservation Alliance, and several more. He became the face of the tunnels for a long time, and is undoubtedly still the face you see when watching documentaries. He was on ghost adventures, working with several local restaurants and bars, including the famous Hobo's, a piano bar that unfortunately closed down during the pandemic. While the tours didn't really seem to venture too much further past the various basements and the establishments above, Jones seemed to favor the theory that the tunnels would have been used to basically store, house, and move people. And it is from him that we are going to start talking about the architecture itself. So when you conduct an image search, the first thing you notice is that the tunnels don't hold a lot of consistency, which is something I would actually expect given that all versions of the history indicate that this wasn't a large-scale organized effort like we saw in the previous episode, but instead an adaptation of an existing system to a much more nefarious purpose. There's a mixture of bricks, stones, and in some images you can see clearly defined moments where the foundation for the building above has been continued down with whatever material was available. Inside various restaurants, you can clearly see still operating trap doors or deadfalls by the bars and throughout the room, leading in many places to cages. In other areas, they have doors leading down to clearly divided rooms, many without extending tunnels. One thing was, apparently there are multiple maps that have been created throughout time by multiple people as they explore that unfortunately I can't put on the blog due to copyright laws, but I noticed several inconsistencies between them. I think for this to move forwards academically and to truly understand the tunnels, a large-scale citywide study would need to be conducted with basically the whole works attached. Unfortunately, the future of the original underground tours is currently uncertain. With the passing of the founder and the various restaurants and locations that were being used to originally host the tours now closed, it seems that there is currently only virtual tours available. Several for-profit copycats have popped up, but I genuinely can't vouch for them. And now for everyone's favorite part, the spooky stories. They say when taking a tour, or even exploring yourself, there is the overwhelming feeling of being watched in the dark. Men were supposedly left down there to die by gangs, and they say they are still trapped there to this day. You can experience hands reaching out for you in the dark, pulling your hair and your clothes, and small movements of shadows moving in ways that they shouldn't, with screams and voices echoing around the expansive sprawl of tunnels. Full body apparitions, people lunging at you in the dark, but the most famous tale is of Nina, and that is spelled Nina, but according to several websites pronounced nine. So 9 is large and then is the small Nina had a tragic life and was a prostitute who worked at the Merchant Hotel in what is now the Old Town Pizza and Brewing Company, which does do its own tours. Nina had longed for a way out of her life, as she was actually one of the many women to have been sold against their will into the trade. She was convinced to become an informant and shared information missionaries against her captors. The deal was that they would eventually save her from the life she was stuck in. However, within a short time, she was found at the bottom of an elevator shaft, though who killed her remains a mystery. But even now, it seems that she remains determined to observe all those who enter the building. Visitors will smell her perfume and see her walking through the building as though even in death, she can't escape the building she was originally trapped in. The last story I wanted to tell was of the most infamous crimp of all time. Now remember from my previous episode that crimp, C-R-I-M-P, was the name given to all of the slave traders who specialized in kidnapping, selling, and tricking people into serving on ships as labor. These people were paid per head, and in some cases, like we're going to see, alive was an option, not a requirement. One of the most famous of these was a man named Joseph Bunko Kelly. Kelly was a man whose morals began and ended at the dollar. As long as he was able to earn money, he didn't particularly care about who he hurt in the process. Bunko was the monker he earned. Think more like Doc Holliday, Billy the Kid, and Pretty Boy Floyd than a street name. And no, it doesn't relate to the dice game. The word we are using is B-U-N-K-O, while the game is more commonly spelt with the C, but can be interchanged depending upon where you are in the world. At the time of his heyday, bunko was a word used to describe conmen, and though they were romanticized often by the papers, they were generally considered to be sleazy people with little regard for other human life. Bunko was one of the ones who was romanticized, and he earned his name as he sold a wooden statue to a captain who, upon realizing he had been tricked, threw it into the river where it was found among the nets of fishermen after floating downriver. While he also wrote an autobiography, another man named Stuart Halbrook took it upon himself to become what Elizabeth Lopeto wrote in The All, his besotted biographer. From my research, I concluded that the allure driving this besotted behavior could be compared to what we see in the States with serial killers. And while Kelly may not have been the one with the knife in his hand directly, he self-proclaimed to have single-handedly condemned 2,000 people to slavery. While his book titled 13 Years in the Oregon Penitentiary and other writings are considered important as social observations, the stories of his life should probably be taken with a grain of salt. In one of his most famous writings, he described being shipwrecked and saved by locals who fed him the flesh of his crew to survive and stew. As shortly after he was forced into cannibalism, he escaped because of a typhoon, was then captured by pirates, which he promptly beat off almost single-handedly, with the bare minimum of help of his crew. Gotta let the crew think that they are tough for morale, of course. Unfortunately, his crimes as a slave trader are all too believable. And after arriving in Portland, the, quote, kidnapping king of Portland, end quote, began his reign of terror. He would sell people dead or alive and wrap the bodies he found. In another famous incident, he stumbled upon some would-be burglars who had attempted to break into a bar, but instead found the cellar of a mortician. By the time he found them, just under half were dead, and he still sold them altogether. His reign came to an end, though, when he was potentially framed by others in the field and convicted of murdering an opium smuggler. Kelly was known to sell clay and pass it off as opium, and had recently angered others. Surprise, surprise. It was during this time in prison that he wrote his book and continued to make even more outlandish stories. Articles as far back as 1919 mention the existence of the tunnels. Other articles from around the same time period also call for the end of Shanghai and the need for increased safety for sailors. The truth may never be known in my lifetime, whether the tunnels were ever used as an express route to the sea or a storage container for the living. But the truth in what we know is horrible enough on its own. As the bard William Shakespeare once said, quote, "The evil men do live after them, the good is oft interred with their bone." Thank you everyone for joining me again and not giving up on this little podcast. Check out the blog as always for the transcript, show notes and sources, and additional exclusive information that I don't have time to talk about on the show. It will be updated sometime before Sunday morning with all of the transcripts for all the episodes I'm releasing this week. Please rate, review, and subscribe if you want to see more content. It seriously helps. But thank you all for sharing in 2022. We reached the top 15% of most shared podcasts globally, and I am so excited and thankful that you all took the time to share. Given that we have just passed our first year of the show with several breaks as I moved across the country and graduated, I just wanted to say thank you for your support. I'm excited to see where 2023 takes us all. You can find me on Instagram at Architecture Coffee and Ink, or hit up my regular Insta if you really like iPhone photography. Email the show at architecturecoffeeandink@gmail.com or the blog at architecturecoffeeandink.com. And those are all linked in the show notes because unlike the name of the show, everything is spelled out A-N-D instead of the ampersand. I'm excited to meet with all my designers, dreamers, and DIY enthusiasts next time. But in the meantime, may your coffee mugs be full and your inkwells never run dry.